Chapter 1. 4 verses that changed biblical history. Some of history's greatest mysteries are hidden in plain sight. They are not buried beneath desert sands or locked inside forgotten tombs. They have been read aloud for thousands of years, copied by countless scribes, translated into hundreds of languages, and studied by some of history's greatest minds. Yet, despite centuries of examination, they remain as mysterious today as they were when they were first written. One such mystery is found in just 4 verses near the beginning of the book of Genesis. 4 verses that introduce strange figures with almost no explanation. 4 verses that have divided rabbis, theologians, historians, and biblical scholars for more than 2,000 years. 4 verses that raise questions the Bible never directly answers. Who were the sons of God? Who were the Nephilim? And why are they mentioned immediately before one of the greatest acts of divine judgment recorded in Scripture, the Great Flood? The passage itself is remarkably brief. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the mighty men of old, men of renown." Genesis 6:1-4. And then the story simply moves on. Genesis offers no immediate explanation of who these beings were. It does not tell us where they came from, what became of them, or why they appear so suddenly in the narrative. Instead, the account shifts almost immediately to humanity's increasing corruption and God's decision to send a flood that would reshape the world. It is this silence that has captivated generations of readers. Some believe the sons of God were fallen angels who crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, producing the Nephilim as their offspring. Others argue they were the descendants of Seth, the righteous son of Adam, who intermarried with the descendants of Cain. A third view sees them as powerful kings or rulers whose pride and corruption spread violence throughout the ancient world. Each interpretation has been defended by respected scholars. Each claims support from Scripture, yet after centuries of debate, no universal agreement has emerged. Adding to the mystery, Genesis is not the only place where unusual giants appear. Later books of the Old Testament speak of the Anakim, the Rephaim, Og of Bashan, and eventually Goliath of Gath. The New Testament contains passages that many believe echo the events of Genesis 6, while others insist they do not. Was Genesis describing a supernatural event, a human tragedy, or something entirely different? To answer those questions, we must first do something that is often overlooked. We must set aside modern assumptions and step into the world of the ancient Israelites, the people who first heard these words. Only then can we begin to understand why 4 short verses have become one of the greatest unresolved mysteries in biblical history. Chapter 2. The World Before the Flood. To understand the mystery of the Nephilim, we must first leave the modern world behind. The book of Genesis was not written to a 21st century audience. It was written to an ancient people living in a world very different from our own, a world where the natural and the supernatural were not viewed as separate realities but as parts of the same story. For the ancient Israelites, God was not distant from creation. Heaven and earth constantly intersected. Angels appeared to people. God spoke through prophets. Dreams carried meaning. The unseen world was understood to be just as real as the physical one. This perspective is essential because modern readers often approach Genesis through the lens of science, archaeology, or philosophy. The original audience approached it through faith, history, and a worldview that accepted both visible and invisible realities. The ancient Near East was also filled with stories about powerful rulers, heavenly beings, and heroes of extraordinary strength. Civilizations such as the Babylonians, Egyptians, Canaanites, and Mesopotamians preserved traditions describing ancient kings, divine councils, and mighty warriors who stood apart from ordinary people. The Bible was written within this cultural landscape, yet it consistently challenged the beliefs of the surrounding nations. Rather than borrowing their mythology, the biblical authors often corrected it, presenting one sovereign God instead of many competing gods. This makes Genesis 6 especially intriguing. When the original audience encountered the phrase sons of God, they would not have assumed it referred to ordinary people without first considering the broader language and traditions familiar to them. Likewise, the sudden appearance of the Nephilim would have immediately signaled that something extraordinary was taking place. At the same time, Genesis refuses to satisfy our curiosity. Unlike the myths of neighboring cultures, the biblical account provides almost no dramatic details. There are no long genealogies of the Nephilim, no heroic adventures, and no elaborate legends explaining their rise or fall. The author tells only what is necessary before moving directly to humanity's growing corruption and God's coming judgment through the flood. That silence may be intentional. Rather than encouraging fascination with mysterious beings, Genesis keeps its primary focus on humanity's relationship with God. The Nephilim appear only briefly, almost like a shadow passing across the page, reminding the reader that something significant occurred without fully explaining it. To understand why these mysterious figures have inspired centuries of debate, we must now examine the three major interpretations that have shaped Jewish and Christian thought. Each attempts to answer the same question: who exactly were the sons of God, and who were the Nephilim? Chapter 3. Three Theories, One Mystery. If Genesis 6 contained only one obvious explanation, the debate would have ended centuries ago. Instead, these 4 verses have produced 3 major interpretations, each defended by respected scholars, theologians, and historians. Each attempts to answer the same question: who were the sons of God, and who were the Nephilim? The oldest known interpretation is often called the angelic view, or the fallen watchers theory. According to this view, the phrase sons of God refers to heavenly beings rather than ordinary human beings. Supporters point to other passages in the Old Testament, particularly the book of Job, where the same Hebrew expression is used to describe members of God's heavenly court. If the phrase carries the same meaning in Genesis, then the passage describes supernatural beings who crossed a boundary established by God, resulting in the birth of the Nephilim. This interpretation was widely accepted during the Second Temple period, the era between the Old and New Testaments. Ancient Jewish writings, especially the Book of Enoch, greatly expand the story, describing a group of heavenly beings known as the Watchers who descended to earth, took human wives, and fathered giant offspring. Although the Book of Enoch is not considered scripture by most Christian traditions, it demonstrates how many Jews before the time of Christ understood Genesis 6. Some scholars also point to the New Testament. The books of Jude and 2 Peter describe angels who sinned, left their proper place, and were placed under judgment. While these passages never explicitly mention the Nephilim, many believe they allude to the events recorded in Genesis 6. Others argue they refer to a different rebellion altogether, showing that even these texts remain subjects of debate. Supporters of the angelic view believe it best explains why the Nephilim are presented as extraordinary figures and why Genesis introduces them so abruptly before the flood. Critics, however, raise an important question: can spiritual beings truly produce physical offspring with human beings? Jesus taught that angels in heaven neither marry nor are given in marriage, leading many theologians to reject the angelic view entirely. This single disagreement has divided interpreters for centuries. To understand why many Christians reject the fallen watchers theory, we must now examine a second interpretation, one that argues the mystery of Genesis 6 has nothing to do with angels at all. Chapter 4. 2 more explanations. While the angelic view has ancient roots and remains widely discussed, it is far from the only interpretation of Genesis 6. Over the centuries, many Jewish and Christian scholars have concluded that the passage describes an entirely human event rather than a supernatural one. Their explanations generally fall into 2 categories: the Sethite view and the royal king's view. The Sethite view became especially influential among early Christian theologians such as Augustine. According to this interpretation, the sons of God were the faithful descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve. In contrast, the daughters of men represented the descendants of Cain, whose family line is associated in Genesis with increasing violence and rebellion against God. Supporters argue that the warning of Genesis 6 is not about angels, but about the spiritual danger of the righteous abandoning their devotion to God by joining themselves to a corrupt culture. Over time, these mixed unions produced a society so consumed by wickedness that God's judgment through the flood became inevitable. This interpretation has several strengths. It preserves the entirely human focus of Genesis, avoids difficult questions about angels producing children, and fits the Bible's recurring theme of faithful people being influenced by surrounding cultures. Yet critics point out a significant weakness. Nowhere in Genesis 6 are the descendants of Seth explicitly called the sons of God. If Moses intended that meaning, why use a phrase that elsewhere in the Old Testament often refers to heavenly beings? A third interpretation approaches the passage from a different direction. Known as the Royal King's view, it argues that the sons of God were powerful rulers or kings who claimed divine authority over others. In many civilizations throughout the ancient Near East, kings were described as the sons or representatives of the gods. According to this view, Genesis condemns human rulers who abused their power, gathered women into royal harems, and filled the earth with violence. Supporters believe this interpretation fits the historical customs of the ancient world while keeping the narrative entirely within human history. Critics, however, note that Genesis never explicitly identifies these figures as kings, leaving the interpretation open to debate. Three theories, three different ways of reading the same 4 verses. Each explains part of the mystery. None answers every question. Perhaps that is why the debate has endured for centuries. But the mystery does not end with Genesis 6. Long after the flood, the Bible introduces another puzzle. It speaks once again of giants, towering figures such as the Anakim, the Rephaim, Og of Bashan, and eventually Goliath of Gath. If the flood wiped out the world of Noah, why do these giants appear again? To answer that question, we must follow the story beyond Genesis and into the pages of Israel's later history. Chapter 5. The Giants Who Shouldn't Exist. If the flood destroyed every living person except Noah, his family, and the animals aboard the ark, one question refuses to disappear. Why do giants appear again? Centuries after the waters receded, the Bible repeatedly describes unusually large and powerful people living in the land of Canaan. When Moses sent 12 spies into the Promised Land, their report was startling. There we saw the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight. Whether the spies were speaking literally, exaggerating out of fear, or using the name Nephilim as a comparison has been debated for generations. What cannot be denied is that they believed they had encountered enemies of extraordinary size. The Old Testament goes on to name several groups associated with giants, including the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Zamzumim. Among them was Og, king of Bashan, whose bed is described in Deuteronomy as being more than 13 feet long. Centuries later, another towering warrior would step onto the battlefield, Goliath of Gath. Do these figures represent the return of the Nephilim? The Bible never says so directly. Some scholars believe the post-flood giants were descendants of the original Nephilim through an unknown means. Others argue they were simply exceptionally tall human populations whose reputation grew through generations of storytelling. Still others believe the spies in Numbers deliberately exaggerated what they saw because fear had distorted their judgment. Each explanation attempts to solve the same puzzle, yet none answers every question. Perhaps that is exactly where Genesis intended to leave us. The author devoted only 4 verses to the Nephilim. He never explained their origin in detail, never described their civilization, and never returned to settle the debate. Instead, the narrative's attention remained fixed on humanity's growing violence, corruption, and separation from God. Maybe that is the lesson. For centuries, readers have searched those 4 verses looking for hidden histories, secret civilizations, or supernatural mysteries. Yet Genesis consistently redirects our attention away from speculation and back to the moral condition of humanity. The Nephilim remain part of the story, but they are not its center. Who were they? The evidence allows several possibilities, but no single interpretation has convinced every generation of readers, and perhaps that is why the mystery has endured for thousands of years. Some questions in history are eventually answered by archaeology, forgotten manuscripts, or new discoveries. Others remain exactly where we first found them, waiting in the silence between the lines. The Nephilim are one of those mysteries, and that is why their story remains unsettled. Thank you for watching Unsettled History. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep following the evidence, and remember, history is rarely as settled as it seems.